Welcome to the Beth Yeshua Podcast. For more episodes like this, visit bethyeshua.org/media. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Beth Yeshua Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Josh Rubenstein, and I'm here with my mom. Hi, Mom.
Hi, greetings.
And today we are joined by a very special guest. This is Erik. Some of you might know him from Two Messianic Jews, which is a podcast that we've actually talked about multiple times. And today we're actually going to be talking with Erik about his, Messianic Viral video, but like a video that sort of took off called How Hebrew Roots is Hijacking Messianic Judaism. And we're really grateful to have Erik with us today. Hi, Erik.
Hi, Josh. Hi, Sherry. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome, dude. It's really great to see you. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. If anybody wants to see it, apparently now Apple Podcasts is doing video too. So you can check it out there or on Spotify. Or if you want to watch us, you can also go to YouTube, check out our YouTube podcast. It's Beth Sacramento. There's a lot of Beth Yeshuas in the Messianic world. So we're one of them. We're the Sacramento one. So anyways, we're gonna jump right in. So the title of this episode, this podcast episode that Erik basically just single hosted and went for an hour and 49 minutes. And I know like some of you might be thinking like, that's very daunting. It was, if you're involved in Messianic Judaism at all, and you have any experience with Hebrew roots or Hebraic roots or one law or any of that, and you're just looking for clarity, man, one of the best hour 49 minutes that you could spend in your life, like for sure. It's up to 4,500 views. It's called How Hebrew Roots is Hijacking Messianic Judaism. And before we jump into like discussing that, I wonder if you could give people a little bit of context of like who you are, Erik, and like maybe even like in addition to who you are and kind of where you're coming from as far as your perspective within Messianic Judaism, why create Two Messianic Jews? Why create the podcast? So if you don't mind, jump right in.
Sure. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. So I grew up in what I would call a Messianic Jewish home. My mom, she's Jewish. My dad's not Jewish. Shortly before they got married, my mom came to faith through a series of spiritual experiences, Isaiah 53, my dad's witness to her. And so they got married, had my older sister, had me, had two younger siblings. And I grew up entirely in the Messianic Jewish world. So before my memory, kicked in, they went to a church for a couple of years. My mom was never comfortable there just as a Jewish person. And so they went to Beth Hillel in Atlanta, Georgia. And I grew up there, had my B'nai Mitzvah there. I did it alongside my younger sister. And so I grew up very much in the kind of MJAA, Messianic Jewish Alliance of America kind of space. Beth Hillel is considered one of the flagship congregations within that world. But I would say I genuinely came to faith when I was 17 at a Beth Hillel youth retreat. And since then, I've served in the YMJA on the leadership team for Messiah Conference for 2 years. And I've been asked to speak at Messiah Conference, both in the YMJA and MJA multiple times over the last 10 or so years, I guess 12 or so years now. And I am married to my wife, Elisa, and we just had our daughter, Gila, 5 months ago. And she grew up in the UMJC world. And so I've been introduced more to the MJC world through her. But even before then, I've been very influenced by a lot of Messianic Jewish theologians and thinkers that have more so found their camp in the UMJC. So David Rudolph, Mark Kinzer, and others, and before that, David Stern in Israel. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from as far as my Messianic Jewish upbringing. And through that, actually, I consider myself kind of a native to the Messianic Jewish world. My closest friends are natives to the Messianic Jewish world. And I really love our community. I owe so much to my rabbi and my local congregation, and so many of the leaders in our community for introducing me to faith, introducing me to ways to strengthen and express my Jewish identity as well as my faith in God and in Yeshua. And so to go into why start Two Messianic Jews, we just wanted to be a voice online that is serving to strengthen and defend the faith and identity of Jewish followers of Yeshua. And so we do that through talking about the Jewishness of Yeshua and the New Testament, combating replacement theology and anti-Semitism, and with a special focus on Hebrew roots replacement theology, which is what the video that we're going to discuss is about. And then also talking about contemporary issues in the Messianic Jewish community. Just our goal is to do our part in at least provoking conversation that is with the goal of strengthening our community and seeing it thrive in the next generations.
I think that voice is so important. You know, my mom and I, we've talked about the fact that it feels like many leaders within Messianic Judaism are really hesitant to put themselves out, right? Like online. And there's a variety of reasons for that, you know, from Aliyah to just like the crazy stuff that you have to deal with in the comment section, and like who has time for that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful. Like like legitimately, I'm not trying to like puff you up. I'm really grateful for you guys being a kind of a voice, because I think more of that is needed. Otherwise, I think the conversation sort of unintentionally gets hijacked, because the only voices out there are ones of people who really don't care, like they don't have those same sorts of concerns about Aliyah or the greater Jewish connection to the greater Jewish world, or any of these other things that are often things that we as Messianic Jews struggle with and really wrestle with before we put ourselves out there. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you.
So you are from MJAA, and your wife was raised UMJC. It's kind of funny. We were just talking about like last week, for whatever reason, and you probably even know this. We could have you on for another episode about this, but we were told at the delegates meeting of the UMJC that the MJAA has decided that congregations can no longer be bi-associated, right? Like they have to choose one or the other between MJAA and UMJC. And I was like, oh man, can't we all just get along? Like, why can't there be love between the UMJC and the MJAA? But look, man, you're embodying it. You
It
like,
is, yeah.
you and your wife
literally married
Right.
the two.
you
Yeah.
found love. So guys, it's possible. There's like actual possibility for deep love between the MJAA and the UMJC.
It's
We just
true.
gotta,
It's very
we need to
true.
all like figure that out. Because honestly, you know, that's another thing about the voice of Messianic Judaism, is it becomes a little bit splintered, right? By the fact that we have kind of like these multiple organizations that all feel like they are the mouthpiece for genuine Messianic Judaism. I genuinely feel like we should all be forced to be locked in a room until we can come out as one. And there's, I mean, like, honestly, there's plenty of room for us all to be one. I think, even theologically, I understand people get frustrated by things, but let's jump into your video on Hebrew roots, hijacking Messianic Judaism. Now, I know for some of the people that listen to our podcasts, they are often wondering what even Hebrew roots is. It's really strange to me, right? Because like our community in particular has had a ton of Hebrew roots. And so for us, it was like kind of a trial by fire. It was, we had to educate ourselves because they were coming. Like as soon as our Beth Yeshua went online, as soon as we had a website, we started like having an influx of primarily Gentile visitors that were like in these somewhere on the spectrum, right, of like Hebraic roots, as you talk about in your video. And we didn't know what it even was when it first began, when that first wave of like Gentile excitement and involvement. In fact, we were just talking about this earlier, my mom and I, like that was a wave that kind of like happened to us at Beth Yeshua. And we were like, what is this? And it grew to the point where when my dad got really sick with cancer,
for our founding rabbi.
Founding rabbi for our congregation, and
Blessed
ended
memory.
up passing very, very suddenly, the Hebrew roots people within our community tried to take over the community.
Oh, wow.
It was wild. And so, I mean, and like that was like finally when like there were white papers out from the UMJC and the MJAA, right?
Yeah.
Like, and there were these things addressing it in a very sort of like like, I don't know, theological and like intellectual sort of a way, but like like there were people in our community that were like, we want to change the fundamental structure of what this community
Mm.
even is or represents. So for us, your video is like stupid important. It's really, really important. And it is strange to me, man. Like even at the UMJC delegates meeting like 2 years ago, I had to stand up because we were voting in some member congregations and associate congregations and say, this community on their website says that they're Hebrew roots.
Mm.
What
They
are we
wanted to
doing?
come in as associates.
Yeah, they wanted
Yeah.
to come in as
Right.
associates, and I was like, "So I absolutely stand against this." And like, I don't know if like all y'all don't understand what Hebrew roots is, but man, we do. And like, so have you noticed that before we jump into your video that there seems to be some people within Messianic Judaism that really understand Hebrew roots and kind of like the negative impact that it can have, and then there are just some people that are clueless and like have no idea. What's been your experience?
That's a really good question. I'd be curious to hear how you guys reacted to it and kind of dealt with that attempted coup, because I give some suggestions as based off of my own kind of thinking through it of things that could happen. But I'm really curious how you guys actually dealt with it as a real life example.
Sure.
And I think in my experience, there's a range of attitudes towards Hebrew roots from Messianic Jewish leaders. There are some who I know they speak very intensely against Hebrew roots. They'll say from the pulpit that Hebrew roots is false teaching, which is wonderful. But then at the same time, I've had conversations with that same rabbi who I have in mind, where even he himself kind of falls into some language patterns, at least, that are at least very compatible to Hebrew roots and to a Hebrew roots person's ear, sound Hebrew roots.
Right.
And so I think there's even some disconnect between the understanding of what Hebrew roots really, what they really kind of latch onto as far as signals to them that a community is for them and a place where they can live out their theology as Hebrew roots people, and kind of that the innate attitude that a lot of our leaders have where they know Hebrew roots is bad, but I think there's a disconnect between really recognizing it, noticing it, and through that taking steps to create healthy boundaries against it through that knowledge that I think is required to really understand kind of where these people are coming from and what they're motivated by and what their goals are. And not to say that they're insidious or, malicious. I think they're often innocent people who have a misdirected passion for following God, which in principle is beautiful, but I think there's some form of misunderstanding the scripture, or even I think a spiritual sort of deception that I think is clouding their judgment as to how to best accomplish that. So I think on one hand we need to have a pastoral heart towards these people in that way, but also have a conviction to protect our community and to protect our flock and to protect our boundaries and what we stand for as a community. And I think both of those things really require a better understanding of the Hebrew roots community themselves, especially as they seek to take part in our own communities.
Yeah, it's
It's
interesting.
so subtle too. We end up with people who've been with us for years that we didn't even really recognize for a long time what was going on. I mean, I recently we had a 4th of July party, and we had hot dogs, and I had one of our non-Jewish members of the congregation say, how do you know that the hot dogs aren't in a pork casing?" And I thought, "Huh, that's an interesting question from a non-Jewish person."
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just these little subtleties that this person's been among us for a long time, and we love him and have grown to love him, and he's never pushed it. So I don't know exactly, and that's back to another question of what do we do once people are with us? How do we minister to them in a way that either they get it and they need to kind of break off from that, or they need to go.
Hmm.
So
I've often I've come to the conviction, and this is just my personal conviction, that um, there is actual real spiritual warfare. That there's an enemy of God's plans, and he has his own evil spiritual tools that he uses, and often kind of like repetitive ways. You don't really see much variance with the enemy, but like often it's about division and argument and complaining and slander, and I mean it's sin, right? So he just stirs up sin, and we experienced firsthand that there seems to be a particular spirit that's attached to Hebrew roots. Now, I think that it might be like I don't know what the names of spirits are or any of that. I'm just like the spiritual fruit that we've discerned from it over and over again. And it's not just Hebrew roots. I think it's often people that are coming from a place, like you said, of like, I think real innocence and wanting to study scripture. There's this tendency towards pride in understanding the scriptures better than other people, right? And there's this sort of like divisiveness, this argumentative sort of fruit that goes along with that of like, well, if I could just convince you, like if we could just go round and round on this, you'll see what I see and your eyes will be opened in the same way my eyes were open. And the practical fruit that we saw from that, like in our community, as we had to deal with it in a very intense way, but also just like as we've seen it in other conversations with people, is there's a divisiveness, there's a splintering. It never unifies. And in fact, when we actually had to deal with this like kind of group within our congregation some years ago, goodness, was that 15 years ago now?
Right.
Yeah, 15 years ago. When we dealt with that, they ended up leaving. It was a large group of people that left. They formed their own congregation, and that congregation splintered after about a year. And what we heard, that we didn't have like super close relationships with them, was it was kind of like theological argumentative stuff again. It was like they even couldn't see eye to eye. They knew that they didn't want Messianic Judaism, that they wanted Hebraic roots, but they couldn't even agree on what that meant. Now, I know that that's an overgeneralization. I think there is a spectrum, right? Like you're
Yeah,
talking
of
about in
course.
your video of where people are at. And I'm kind of curious, like you came up with in your video, and I know I'm not going off any of the questions I said I was going to ask you, and I'm so sorry, Eric.
It's all right.
So we'll
It's all
get to
right.
some of those. But like you came up with this spectrum that I thought was to me, it was a loving way to approach it. I know that like for maybe people who call themselves Hebrew roots or really identify with it, anything that you do to label it and say, hey, this is not good for the Messianic Jewish movement is going to feel hurtful to them. But I thought
Yeah.
that there was a lot of compassion in that as you were like actually looking at that. What gave you that idea of kind of like evaluating it as a spectrum of like where these ideological, theological beliefs like landed for people on that, I don't know, spectrum?
Yeah, so honestly, that just came from becoming more familiar with the Hebrew roots community on one hand, so exploring all these different YouTube channels and websites. They're a very online community. It's a very
Yes.
online driven community. And seeing all these different tones that they take and kind of theological leanings that they take, it's really difficult to really put them all as a monolith. I did my best to provide a definition that is as encapsulating as possible, but these are very disparate groups, they're disconnected groups, and they have their own little quirks and idiosyncrasies and things like that, and slightly different priorities in certain cases. And so I found that as a way to supplement a general definition, it would just be more helpful for people's understanding to provide a delineated spectrum that kind of carves out the diversity within this community, to not make it come across as if it's monolithic. So that's one reason. And then the other reason is also just being very conscious of our own community. I've met and spoken with, especially over the course of my life, hundreds of people, even particularly about this issue over the last few years, dozens of people, if not over 100. And we have to recognize that the Hebrew roots community has influenced our own flock, our own people. and to the point where a lot of people who I believe belong in our community as Gentiles, they are influenced by these Hebrew roots ways of speaking and theological ideas and ways of behavior that I think is mostly accidental on their part. So that's
Mm,
an entire category that I created of an accidental Hebrew roots person, and I largely had in mind Gentiles in Messianic congregations who I've had conversations with where, unbeknownst to them, things that they were saying and doing and ideas that they were having about themselves derive from Hebrew roots. But all it took was me explaining that and then also explaining, how to correct that perspective. And they were just like, oh, you know what? What you're saying makes a lot of sense.
Great.
Never mind about that Hebrew root stuff. I don't want to be that. I recognize that as false. Thank you for sharing that with me. And so that was clearly a loosely held language pattern, I like to call it, because it wasn't like a deep-seated belief that they had, but they were influenced by the Hebrew roots community. But what it took, my advice for how to react to somebody who may be accidental Hebrew roots is simply to have some pastoral conversations with them, and more likely than not, they'll simply change their mind um, without much controversy or without much difficulty, or at most it just takes a few conversations and it takes some time for it to kind of sink in. And so it also comes from an awareness of that, where I think large portions of our community, even Jewish people. This isn't unique to Gentiles in the Messianic world, where even Jewish people have fallen into, I think, unwittingly,
mhm.
Hebrew roots ways of speaking and
Yeah.
thinking that I think is just kind of unconscious and unwittingly uncritical about it, and not as reflective as it should be. So also wanted to, on one hand, provide that warning that it's possible to accidentally be Hebrew roots, but on the other hand, provide that kind of lane of grace to not overly react to like if you overhear somebody, on Shabbat morning say something that sounds Hebrew roots, don't automatically, jump down their throat and say, "What are you doing here?" Maybe they're an accidental Hebrew roots person, and just have a conversation with them, find out more about where they're coming from, what they
That's
meant
good.
by what they said, and just have a conversation with that person, like a friend, and see where it goes from there.
Yeah. I love that. It's as you're talking, it's making me think that the element of pastoral care, um, like within the UMJC, there's a few organizations that you can go and pursue, like the MJTI and some other yeshivas, and you can pursue essentially your rabbinic credential, and then you can be ordained by the UMJC. I wonder if some of those organizations like the MJTI and others need to look at adding a class or two about like loving pastoral care for the Hebrew roots among your community. Because
Sounds good.
as you spoke about in your video, the Hebrew roots community sends people to our congregations. So you're for sure going to run into them. And if you're not prepared to have those types of conversations, now we've done something that I don't know. It might be a little bit radical, and I don't know if you would appreciate it from your loving and pastoral heart. But we've decided to just take our address offline. And so people have to email us and we have to vet them essentially before they come. Because for us, and my mom can attest to this, over the last, she kind of took over the vetting process, I'd say in October or something like that. Was it, Mom? And since then, she's had hundreds of emails with people that are interested in visiting the community.
Wow.
And I would say it's interesting. She's keeping stats on them because she's kind of a nerd. But like,
I
and you
love
might
that.
be interested in this actually.
Yeah, I am.
Like as far as like, sort of an intellectual pursuit of this, but she knows that what I think 2/3 of those emails are from non-Jewish people, right?
Two-thirds are non-Jewish people who self-defining as
Yeah,
non-Jewish. The other third are defining as Jewish, but then kind of when you get into it, sometimes they're not. I'm
Right.
not even going about whether or not it's maternal or paternal. It's not about that.
Sure.
Do you have a Jewish parent?
well,
But
for
they
us, it's
don't.
even a
They just
grandparent.
have, yeah,
That's our
even a grandparent, right?
community
But
standard.
they have practices. They've come from this or that or whatever. But at any rate, the ones that are non-Jewish, many of them are just right up front. We're all one now. We are part of the Commonwealth.
Right.
We are essentially we're all Jews now.
Right.
And I try to have a pastoral heart and responding to them, I don't say sweetie, but I almost do. Like, say, well, sweetie, I don't. My grandmother thing kicks in, but I try to be loving about it, but that's not who we are. And our mission is to work with Jews who are either coming to faith or already have faith in Yeshua, but they have no place to worship and keep that identity.
Right.
That's who we are. And that's what we have to kind of save this Jewish space for them. And can you see, we would be overwhelmed. 100, over 150. I mean, I didn't write down the ones that are saying, "Hey, I'm calling from Kenya," I mean,
Right. Yeah.
one that just wanted to sell us, "Can we clean your building?" or whatever. Like I don't even keep those on the stats. But it's pretty crazy if we had all those people even visit us. You
So
know,
that would have
I,
been 100 visitors since
150,
October.
150 households.
Well, no,
Right.
that's
So it's going to
100
be
and
couples.
no.
Will it be?
150 was the total number.
It's a total number of inquiries,
So
and each inquiry could be
2/3 of that is
2/3 of that are not Jewish
okay.
and
Yeah.
self-proclaiming not
Yeah.
Jewish.
So 100. That would be 100 people or families that
Our
would have
families
visited since
since October.
October. And
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
what we experience historically in our community. And I know that it's not like that for every community. I don't know what it's like at your home congregation. Would you say that you have like overwhelmingly, primarily like Gentile visitors, or do you get a good mixture of both? What is it like in your home community?
Well, so I think before answering that question, remind me to answer it if
Yeah.
I forget. But I do want to acknowledge there is a tension here between what I said earlier of having a pastoral heart to these people who find themselves in our congregations, but then also standing for the purpose on which our congregations exist, which is to serve Jewish people to come to know Yeshua, who already know Yeshua, to be a place where they can express their faith in Yeshua through Jewish tradition, preserve their Jewish identities, and with whomever else wants to support and join alongside of that. And so, I think we have to remember that our congregations are not meant to be ministries for Hebrew roots people to be reformed,
Right.
essentially, from away from their Hebrew roots.
Rescued, essentially. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
so I think, send them to Two Messianic Jews, send them some, that's our job.
Right.
But the congregation is not intended to accomplish that. On the other hand, if you found that a long-term member, you had a conversation with them after they've been there for 6 years, they finally, you finally realize that they're Hebrew roots, I think you should treat that person a little bit differently than if somebody who walks in off the street and they have all like the bell loop seat and the Paleo Hebrew divine name on their t-shirt and they're blowing shofar. Those are two different sorts of situations of how to handle that kind of Hebrew roots person. And so I think I love what you guys did. I think that's actually really prudent to make yourselves less accessible to the masses of those who are searching out for Messianic congregations. And so, to your question about my own community, I find that I I could probably have a conversation with a Hebrew roots person every week. I don't feel like we're overwhelmed by them. It's not like there's an entire contingent of like, oh, there's the Hebrew roots people over there. But each week I see somebody or I talk to somebody and they fall somewhere in that spectrum of Hebrew roots. On the other hand, I think our congregation does have a higher percentage of Jewish membership than the average. It's somewhere 40-ish%. But on the other hand, as far as visitors go, I think we certainly get more Gentile visitors, whether that's Christian or Hebrew roots or family members, much more than we get Jewish visitors, I would say. So that's been my experience there, and my understanding is that somewhat typical in the Messianic world.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I forget. Oh, man, somebody wrote a booklet like a while ago, and it was like Messianic Judaism, who sold this business to the Gentiles. Oh, goodness. There's something that I had to read for one of my MJTI classes. I don't know. I'll have to look it up. But I think that this has been an issue and I know that makes it sound like it's bad, but it's been a reality since this kind of renewal that happened in the 60s and 70s. And then I would say that like kind of once the 90s rolled around and there was websites, there
Yeah.
were a lot of these Gentiles who were having what I think is actually a genuine revelation from God, a love for the Jewish people, a love for Yeshua as a Jew, a love for understanding the Brit Hadashah and everything else from within that Jewish perspective. And there's this richness and sweetness. And so I think that there's been this reality of us being sought out. And I mean Messianic Jewish communities being sought out by Gentiles who have that heart for a while, but I think it got diverted. I think that it wasn't always like, and I still think it's being diverted. I think it's just, unfortunately, we have like Google now. And so like when a person has this spiritual like awakening or excitement or something happens inside of them with that Ruth heart, they Google like, I really love the Jewish people. What's this all about? And they find Hebrew roots. And it gives them this
Right.
structure of like, well, you're a
Right.
Jew. That's what this means. And so here's your tzitzit. And it's
Yeah.
like, I feel like this struggle is something that sort of grew out of a genuine spirit movement. And I think that there's still a genuine spirit movement. I think it's one of the ways that you like I see it as like the crowning jewels of the nations that Isaiah speaks of, like taking the daughters of Israel back on their
Mm.
shoulders and rebuilding the land, right? Like most Gentile believers aren't going to do that, but these ones with the Ruth heart and love for the Jewish people, they're not going to buy into the anti-Semitism, and they're like, yes, I'm going to stand with Israel and I'll carry the daughters back on my shoulders and I'll rebuild the land. And there's this sweetness and purity about it. And then it, the enemy wants to get involved and like divert it and make it into nonsense. And no, this is about you being a Jew. And like, it's just all this stuff that obfuscates, confuses what the actual purpose or maybe the original intent was supposed to be.
I absolutely agree with that. And you mentioned the spiritual warfare aspect a number of times, and I agree with that. And to me, the hallmark indicator for that is actually the taking of that beautiful truth that you highlighted. They're recognizing that Yeshua is Jewish, still is Jewish, that the disciples were Jewish, that Israel is still God's chosen people. Replacement theology is false. But then the enemy inverts it. So it's not even just a lie, but it's an inversion of something good and true. And I think that's something that we see, I think, in other aspects of culture today, especially when it comes to identity, gender identity as an example of an actual, like a literal inversion of the truth.
Right.
And I think Satan, as the father of lies, like that is his expertise. I think where he takes a good and true starting point, but then takes it into a direction that is actually confusing and divisive and even destructive at times. And I think that's something that we see in the Hebrew roots community, and not only from the perspective of them dividing Messianic congregations, and even I hear stories about churches, and then they have splits among themselves, which that's all tragic. But I also see and recognize a division caused within themselves, like this confusion of their own identity of who
Yes.
God made them to be. Just like you were saying, like, oh, I'm not a Gentile, I'm a Jew, or I'm an Israelite. There's in my experience listening to these teachers and having conversations with people who kind of fall in this camp, there's a real aversion to being a non-Jew or being a Gentile or being something other than Israel. And I think that
Because
is,
it's a chosen people.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so they take that starting point and they say, "Oh, I want all the blessings that are available to me, and God gives all these blessings to Israel, and I want those blessings too, and those blessings are accessible through keeping the Torah, so I'm going to keep the Torah, so I get those blessings too." And Jonathan and I, we recently did a 8-hour seminar at a congregation in Houston. It was titled "One in Messiah: Defending Jewish and Gentile Identity Against Replacement Theology." And there was and the very last hour we addressed Hebrew roots in particular. But as I talked about in the video, Hebrew roots is really based off of replacement theology presuppositions and premises, even though they have the right impulse to reject replacement theology, but then they espouse it and rely on it because it justifies their final outcome that they're desiring, which is reasons to keep Israel specific mitzvot in the Torah. But so we do the first 4 hours of this seminar on day one before we even talk about Hebrew roots explicitly. And this couple came up to us, and we had background knowledge from a friend of ours that they either are or kind of on this journey of being Hebrew roots, but kind of thinking things through. And they came up to us and they said that something really clicked for them listening to our presentation, that it's not healthy to have this attitude of like, what blessings can I receive, through keeping the Torah? Instead, our attitude should be like, how can we bless Israel? How can we bless others? Like this outward focus towards loving your neighbor, essentially,
Right.
instead of, how much can I get? And I think that's a really profound perspective change that I think even informs one's identity, especially as a follower of Yeshua and as a child of God. Like fundamentally, we are living out who we are meant to be when we are focused on loving others and blessing others than trying to just stockpile as many blessings as we can, even those that aren't given specifically to us. But they feel like they need to take on an identity in order to receive those blessings that are unique to Israel. And it results in a lot of this identity confusion, which I think is a very tragic thing.
Yeah.
Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to the spiritual warfare and also the pastoral kind of aspect to it.
I think
especially when dealing with Gentiles who've been affected by this, who I think should be in the Messianic community. Like if they're intermarried, they're raising Jewish kids, but they are curious, like, how do I actually fit into all this as a Gentile?
Right.
I think our community has really fallen short in providing theological and practical resources for how to inform the identity and affirm the identity of a Gentile who is called to our community. And so that leaves them at the whims of Google, and they find Hebrew roots and they get sucked in because they're actually finding answers to a lot of Hebrew roots. People have the same questions that Gentiles in our community has, because when you're around Jewish people who believe in Yeshua and you're around Jewish tradition and you're thinking through, okay, like that raises questions like, okay, what's my relationship to Israel? What's my relationship to Jewish tradition? I'm in it, I'm part of it, but I'm not used to it. I'm not Jewish. How do I fit into all of this?
Yeah.
And those are the questions that Hebrew roots people are answering.
Right.
And so they'll find those answers and they'll really latch onto that as a way to anchor their role and their place in our community. And it results in an unhealthy Hebrew roots attitude, and that causes tension in families. That I've spoken with people where that's been the case, and I think we just need to do a better job of affirming Gentile identity in a way that is biblically sound, and in a way that actually is conscious of the Hebrew roots directions where this can go, where we know that the fruit is bad. And so that's something that I try to do in the video as well, and in other videos on Two Messianic Jews. I made one video called 8 Reasons Why Gentiles Matter in God's Kingdom, where that's my attempt to kind of start and contribute to this conversation about how Gentile identity matters in God's kingdom from a Messianic Jewish perspective in particular, in contrast to Christian perspectives and in contrast to Hebrew roots perspectives as well.
I want to bring up a point. You say that it's your father who's not Jewish and your mother is Jewish. We have the reverse. I'm not Jewish. And my husband was Jewish, Richard Rubenstein. Oh, never mind. No last names. What am I saying? But at any rate.
We already said our last names.
We already did.
Just no last names for Erik. We're good. We're good.
Okay. But I have to tell you, coming into this movement, I mean, I married a man and I knew he was Jewish, but then we all come to faith and he becomes a rabbi. What am I supposed to do? And I really didn't know what to do for a long time. And I have a heart for people, particularly those mixed marriages, to make sure that the non-Jewish one understands how how sweet it is that they are willing to kind of put on a back burner all the various cultures they may come from, et cetera, to make sure that those kids in that home know who they are. I'm assuming your dad did that. And I mean, he was the Ruth-hearted one. I'm the Ruth-hearted one. Uh, and I get that, and I have a heart for that. Josh and I recently um, realized that with some of these newcomers we've had, most of our people are mixed marriages. Josh is the only one married to a Jew, and I have a grandson who's married to a Jewish woman. But other than that, everybody is a mixed marriage, except for we have some that are just strictly just Gentile, but healthy Gentiles called to walk alongside us. So
Yeah.
I feel like the class is doing something, and I have an opportunity to really honor those Gentiles who are taking that on. We have this one young couple that the man is Jewish and the woman is not, and they have a couple of little kids, and she's just the sweetest, Ruth-hearted person, and not presuming, et cetera. And I just feel like that's one way we can directly do it. We can directly have classes. And I think you even mentioned something about when we do bar mitzvahs for kids, that we might do something that's more called like a righteous Gentile confirmation or whatever, to try to really acknowledge, because kids in our congregation who are not Jewish don't quite know what to do with it. If their parents don't know what to do with it, they really don't know what to do with it. And I think as a children's ministry person, it's very important that we reach out to them. But kind of do you see that any differently, that the person who's called to marry a Jewish person has any different way of dealing with them than you would just any other person? Has that occurred in your congregations, et cetera, or in any kind of way where you want to affirm them in some kind of way?
If I can just
Uh,
add like a little caveat first.
yes, yes.
I just want to say, I think it's very difficult to properly celebrate without clarity of identity. So I think that one of the issues we've run into in our community is it's really hard to celebrate a Gentile coming up and like maybe leading that second part of the Elenu or whatever. It's very difficult for that to happen when you have Hebraic roots in the room as well, because it sends a message to them that's counter to the actual message that you're trying to send to the community, which is like, I'm celebrating the fact that so-and-so is a Gentile, and that they are righteous from the nation, and they're standing beside the Jewish people at maybe even personal cost to themselves. And this is a beautiful thing. And it's almost like if you were to have a women's parade, but you had a whole bunch of transgender people part of the women's parade, and then you had a transgender person speak as the honored guest at that women's parade. I think the biological women in the crowd would be like, what are we doing? What is it? I'm sorry, who are we celebrating? So I'm saying that, like, I feel like we've been able to come to that place in our community, Bubby, because we now have demanded a very clear identity as people are coming in the door. And we're having those conversations first. And to me, we're on the cusp, I think, of a proper celebrating now, right? We're like, because we know everybody is in the room for the right heart reason, now we can actually celebrate it. Because before, when we celebrated it, or when we we used to do like bar and ba Avrahams. Remember that? And man, like
Right.
as the youth leader at the time of our community, oh, it was confusing, man. Like it was just like such a mess. Kids didn't know who they were. Adults didn't know who they were. So like celebrating any sort of meaningful, proper heart attachment to the Jewish community for a Gentile kid was like broken. Anyway, so that's just my caveat before we go into like body ministry and how intermarriage maybe should be differentiated from like a,
Or if it should,
right.
even. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Josh. I think we have to be very careful of what it looks like to celebrate Gentiles in our community. I think for a lot of Messianic Jewish congregations, the means of which they want to express the unity between Jew and Gentile and the equality between Jew and Gentile is actually by absorbing Gentiles into Jewish traditions.
Mm.
So, we're equal, we're united, therefore Gentiles should be able to wear a tallis, therefore Gentiles should have a bar mitzvah or a virtual equivalent, therefore they should be able to have an aliyah and even do a kind of a, this isn't super common, but I've heard of kind of Gentile versions of a Brit Milah because we're equal and united and one in Messiah.
Whoa. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so there's another thing there where it's done with, good intentions, you could say, but I think it's ultimately the cause or a cause of a second-class citizenship feeling within Gentiles in our community. Now, ironically, people will, they'll watch my video and some people will say that I'm creating kind of a class system by encouraging, a select few ritual distinctions between Jew and Gentile, where in my perspective, it affirms Gentile identity and it clarifies the display of unity between Jew and Gentile as you were describing. But for those where they think that equality and unity must be displayed through uniform practice,
Right.
it comes across very differently.
Right.
Whereas my perspective is the Torah itself was given to set Israel apart from the nations.
Right.
And so it doesn't really make sense to use the Torah as our means of expressing equality and unity when it was designed to create distinction. Like, it's using the wrong tool for the job if that's what we're going for. I think Ephesians 4, 1-6 is a great place to start, where, it says that our unity is found in shared faith, in shared immersion, and elsewhere, shared communion. I know communion, is a whole host of conversations in the Messianic community, but I think communion is a biblical place where unity between Jew and Gentile in the body of Messiah is kind of at its peak expression. So there's other means through which Scripture has shared with us to express that unity and equality between Jew and Gentile, and something other than Torah, which I think was the exact answer given by Acts 15 and in the Jerusalem Council and other passages that could be pointed to. But in regards to, I think, Sherry, were you asking, would I treat or have a conversation with an intermarried person, Gentile, who's influenced by Hebrew roots in a different way than a non-intermarried Hebrew roots person, or was the question
Well,
something else?
it wasn't really about whether or not they're influenced by Hebrew roots, but I think there's a question at first about what does it mean. I mean, I came into it so blindly, I really didn't know. Was I supposed to become Jewish? I didn't understand any of that. And I mean, I had people, well-respected people on one side saying, yes, yeah, you're an echad and that's who you need to be. And I had well-respected people on the other camp, so to speak, who were saying the opposite. It's like, you're a Gentile and be a Gentile, but be supportive of the identity in your family, because you're having children, you're having grandchildren, etc. So it was more that standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in general, my default position is more of that latter description of what you gave, is instead of defaulting to a conversation about conversion, I'm in agreement with you. I think just one Jewish parent is what makes a child Jewish. And so I don't see a compulsory need, certainly, to default to a conversion for an intermarried sort of situation. And so I think our community, we should be experts on this mixed marriage question.
We should be.
We should be.
We need to be.
We need to
have
be. I don't think we are that yet, but I think we really should be. And I think it's a story comes to mind where I have there's a couple that they're friends of mine and Elisa's, and kind of reconnected recently after I at least knew one person in the couple for many years, and they're a mixed marriage, so she's Jewish and her husband is Gentile, and he actually is very comfortable. I believe he worked at a JCC. And so he operated in Jewish spaces where certain distinctions were made between he as a Gentile and Jewish traditions that he was around, just by nature of being involved in a Jewish space. And so for him, that was normal. You know, when a Gentile is part of a Jewish community, certain things Gentiles don't do. And, you know, he wasn't offended by it. He understood it. They get married. He's introduced to a Messianic congregation for the first time, and people are trying to throw a tallis over his shoulders.
I know.
And he's actually saying, I'd rather not. And the members of the congregation are actually offended by him for rejecting,
for having clarity.
For having clarity on this issue, and in a real comfort and security in who he is as a Gentile. And so I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn. You know, of course, we should shape it for ourselves because we have, you know, different and additional, you know, factors to consider. But there's a lot to be learned from Reform Judaism, from conservative Judaism, and even from Orthodox Judaism, like where they ask questions about Gentile involvement in their congregation. Like we should be at least familiar with their perspective and see how they do it. Because I've been to many non-Messianic Jewish synagogues where there's clearly non-Jews there, but they're participating as non-Jews, and at least from the outside looking in, there doesn't seem to be any issue with that. And so if they can accomplish it, then how much more should we be able to accomplish it when there is like this real unity in Messiah? And so I think the people like yourself, Sherry, then my dad, and Gentile members of intermarried couples, they really should be celebrated for the sacrifice that's required, you know, to raise their kids Jewish, especially, and to play a role in their spouse's continuation of their Jewish identity. I think that's one of the most beautiful things that takes place in our community, are Gentiles who really sacrifice a lot for that to happen, which I think is also something that isn't acknowledged very much. You know, there's, you know, we at least in the circles that I have found myself in, there's almost entirely just talking about how beautiful it is to participate as a Gentile in the Messianic community, which of course there are beautiful parts to it, but there's also real sacrifice to it. You know, it's like my dad, he loved going to church, you know, and the Jewish stuff didn't automatically click for him, you know, like there was things that took time and took explanation and took, you know, growing in comfort, and like it's a real, like, it's a real, I don't want to say burden, but it's a real sacrifice and a real journey. It's a real cost to that. Yeah, thank you. That's a much better word. And I owe my Jewish identity to my Gentile dad, you know, not just.
That's how I feel about my mom.
Exactly. Like not just literally from like birthing, like creating me, but also from, you know, doing like supporting my mom's desire to light Shabbat candles, you know, on a Friday night. And he took me to bar mitzvah class, you know, for 2 years early in the morning, you know, and like he really played an active role in the formation of my Jewish identity, not just my Jewish biology, you know. And so I think there's a real acknowledgement that we owe to these Gentiles in our community, but it must be done in a way that is affirming of their Gentile identity, not in a way that ultimately confuses their Gentile identity.
We've had a conversation within our leadership team of, oh goodness, I've got to give a little bit of history. COVID hit, and I just felt very convicted by God that we were essentially like a de facto Hebrew roots community. And not really in any sort of deliberate way, but just because we had a lot of people that were hanging out maybe for the wrong reasons, right? So I read our bylaws to the community via Zoom, which is such a pansy way to do it, right? Like you should at least wait for everybody to be back in person and then read them. But I said, guys, this is why we actually exist, right? Yeah. And so if that's not why you're here, no harm, no foul. But this needs to be what we're actually doing.
That's good.
And a lot of my leaders at the time were offended. And they were primarily offended, I think, by the valuative proposition. So there's this thing within consumer religion that we have, at least in the Western world, where like my religion is about me. It's about what I get out of it. And I'm going to shop around and I'm going to get the best experience. And how dare somebody say, like, this is not for me? Or like, this is between me and God. How dare you? Which brings me a little bit to your comments that you got on your video, where people were like, this is a word from God. How dare you, Erik? And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. So, but we still have leaders that are wrestling with the fact that there needs to be clarity of identity, because to them, even, it feels like a valuative proposition. It's almost like we're going to uphold male and female, and they get to do different things because males do different things and females do different things. And that makes sense. But like Jew and Gentile, you say that, and it's like, whoa, that doesn't make sense. Like, the only way for us to have the same value in God's eyes is for us to be doing the same things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes this very like, and I think it is kind of this lie of consumer religion of like, this, what's in it for me? This is about me. And really, like, the kingdom of heaven is not about us at all. And actually, like, in a very real way, as Jewish people, our call is to be a light to the nations. We're functioning at our highest when we're actually being a light to Gentiles around us, and they're seeing Messiah come through us. They're provoked. They're provoked to envy, in the same way that Gentiles provoke Jews to envy. There's this sweetness of two jobs that we're not actually anointed to do for one another. Like, and I see that just in a practical way in my own life, but also in the lives of like all of the Jewish people, almost all of the Jewish people who have come to faith in our community. It was through a Gentile, right?
Yeah.
In fact, I think it was even my Gentile mom who prayed with me when I fell in love with Yeshua when I was
Mm-hmm.
4 years old.
It's beautiful.
So there's this sweetness and there's this anointing and there's like this, like, why are we desiring each other's jobs? But anyways, so like their feeling sometimes in the leadership team is like, we're not valuing Gentiles by having distinction. And I'm like, well, we're not going to be able to honor the Gentiles properly until there is distinction, until there's a real clarity of being a Gentile does not make you a second-class citizen. And that to me is one of the most frustrating and evil lies about Hebrew roots. I'm just going to call it evil, because it tells people that they are not worthy of a son and daughter relationship with God unless they're doing X, Y, and Z. And I'm so sick of observance being the thing that validates people in the kingdom of heaven. The sacrifice of Yeshua is recklessly free. Like, you don't have to put anything in. He already loved you before you were born and sacrificed for you before you were born. And like, it frustrates me when I see people feel like they have to jump through hoops. I'm not saying it's always from the enemy, but like, man, we have to be so careful about where our value comes from. And this is even why when I look at like Galatians and Ephesians, I see Paul wrestling with this with people. He's like, no, there's this unity in the love of Messiah. Don't feel like you're not loved because you don't have the same job. And it's hard, like, right? Like when we all like look at the person up on platform, we figure that person has a lot more value in the kingdom of heaven than the person that's just sitting right next to us. And it's not the way God works. And so it's been a journey. I think it's a journey still for some on my leadership team of like, how are we going to be able to properly celebrate Gentiles? And I'm like, well, there are some Gentiles we should not celebrate being in our midst. If they're not in here for the right reason, then they shouldn't be celebrated. We shouldn't be celebrating people that are taking on a Jewish identity, either in a knowing or an unknowing way. We shouldn't be celebrating people that really are feeling that their value has gone up in the kingdom of heaven, which goes back to a white paper that Stuart Dowerman wrote about why Gentiles attach themselves to Messianic Judaism. It's a really good one. He had like 8 primary reasons. Anyways, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the comments in your video. So finally getting to like the one question that I told you I was going to ask you, like, it seems to me that the comment section has no idea. Like they don't understand what you're even talking about. They feel like when you say there should be distinction, that it feels like a value. It feels like you need to,
and not distinction.
right.
That's
You
what,
need to
yeah.
sit in your
Yeah.
place, Gentiles, and don't be involved in this because this is not for you. And I understand how a person could hear distinction as value, but I was just wondering what it's like just as a brother in the Lord, man. Like, how do you wade through the comment section and keep a spiritual and pastoral mindset? Because I would have lost my mind. Like, there's 315 comments in there right now. Like, I don't know how you go through that. Is that part of like why you're doing what you're doing, so you can have some of those conversations in the comment section? Does that even does that bring fruit, or is that just a bunch of like people throwing fists at I don't know, flailing against the internet? I don't know. What is that like? What is the comment section for you? I'm just really curious.
That's a really good question. And I really sympathize, and I recognize why many people turn comments off, especially on YouTube. I think comments in other forums like Spotify are maybe a little less unhinged,
Yeah.
but at least on YouTube especially, it can get really, really, kind of wading through the muck. But there's a couple different perspectives I have that I can certainly change on any given on any given day. But at least my mentality so far, especially with that video, is on one hand, I want a lot of people to see the video.
Yeah.
And on YouTube rewards you for a lot of comments. So comments signal to the algorithm that people care about this. Let's push it out to more people. So there's kind of an instrumental, purpose in leaving that on, and even with engaging the comments in order to provoke further discussion and get a little bit of a bump from the algorithm. So that that's a very kind of mechanical reason why leaving the comments up and engaging with them. But then a more kind of ministerial reason is I do find on one hand, you don't want to take comments too seriously. It is the internet. You know that if these people were with you face to face, they would be responding in much different ways.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, it's not real. On the other hand, there is a real person, behind probably most, there's, bots exist, but, for the most part, I think on my videos, like these are real people who are expressing something that stirred in them.
Yeah.
And they're, I pray that my responses do something for them. But I think most of all, it's for the kind of people who read comments but don't leave comments. I think there are some people who are much more good-natured than the people you would see in the comments, but maybe they have a lot of the same questions that people have in the comments. And so, or even the same reaction or the same kind of accusation against my video pops into their mind, but they don't have the same, passion to actually leave a comment, but they are curious, like what's going on here. And I feel like I'm talking more to that person than to the actual person I'm responding to, especially if it is clearly a vitriolic kind of comment. But every once in a while you do see, I think, a comment made in good faith. But in this video in particular, which I was anticipating, so I wasn't shocked by the reaction in the comments, but was essentially what we're pretty much discussing now is these accusations that I'm discriminatory or that I'm anti-Gentile. And the funny thing is, this video probably could have been 30 minutes shorter if I didn't take as much time as I did to affirm Gentiles and to discuss the theological value of Gentiles and my perspective of what it means to affirm Gentile identity, what it means to, and my desire to avoid hiding Gentiles in our midst underneath the tallis, for example. And so I feel very confident that I did my job in clarifying that this is not an anti-Gentile perspective that I'm sharing. but that it's rather an anti-Hebrew roots perspective. I think, that's a subcategory of Gentiles. And I mean, a few Jewish people hold to it too. And I think that's also a problem.
Mm.
And so
That's
it's
true.
more so a theological and a behavioral and a mission-based, kind of a purpose-driven, you know, uh, dispute than it is,
Yes.
certainly than it is just like Jew versus Gentile. Especially when I go through, I did a survey earlier this year about Hebrew roots in Messianic congregations, and a good number of non-Jews participated in the survey, and they were just as upset about Hebrew roots as Jewish people were. And so
Wow.
I share a lot of those perspectives in the video as well. And so it certainly is
That's
not a
good.
Jew versus Gentile issue, but it certainly has been received that way by some. And so that's kind of my perspective on the comments. I don't lose any sleep over comments. What I find much more unfortunate than, inflamed commenters is when I hear of leaders who I know personally and leaders in our community where they jump to that conclusion when I know they haven't watched the video yet, or they haven't really talked to me about it yet. That I have a harder time with, where I would hope that they would give me more of a benefit of the doubt and actually watch the video and watch other content and articles that I've written that I think clearly explain my position as not simply being discriminatory or anti-Gentile, but rather, as we were talking about, a way to celebrate our unique God-given identities in a way that I think it's kind of against the current status quo in our community. So it's maybe a little counterintuitive, but I think it's a perspective worth considering. That specifically being, in my reading of this and observation of this, is, like I was saying earlier, the way to welcome Gentiles and include Gentiles and express our equality and unity with them is by giving every Jewish ritual, make it every single one available to them and absorb them into Jewish practice. Whereas I think that's actually counterproductive with affirming Gentile identity. If I walk into a room and 50 men are wearing taluses and 40 of them are Gentiles,
Jewish. Yeah.
they all look Jewish to me. Like, how can I celebrate that there's Gentiles and Jews together if everybody looks like a Jew? It's like, so from my perspective, that's actually hiding the Gentiles among us instead of celebrating them. And so, of course, I made it a YouTube video, like it's an open conversation, but that's my perspective. And I hope that at least people can understand it, even if they disagree with it.
It is so interesting to me that I remember a time at our community where a talit was simply a prayer garment for men.
Yeah.
And it was definitely not for women. And so even if you were a Jewish woman and you had had a bat mitzvah, it was not for you. And like, dude, oh man, the growth that Messianic Judaism has had to go through since really the kind of the redefining in the 70s is, I think, kind of staggering, right? Like, of finding its footing very quickly, being kind of this renewal movement of the Ruach that I feel has gone really hand in hand with the renewal of the land of Israel. And I think we're going to see more and more as Israel awakens to Messiah. I think we're going to see more and more Jews in the diaspora also falling in love with Yeshua. That's my own personal theories. But like this reality of like, we can't be in a church because they're just going to make us into Christians, and we can't go to the synagogue because they're going to kick us out once they find out we love Yeshua. So we're going to have to invent a new space. And now we've got this new space, and so we're going to have bar bat mitzvahs for our kids. Oh man, we need to learn Hebrew. And so like we actually really need to understand what like Jewish life is. And so we're going to define all of that. Oh, the internet's here. That'll help other Jewish people find us. Whew, waves of Gentiles. What's happening? Now we've got to figure this out. Like, and there's such a power in the fact that we're going through this struggle. I see this as a foundation, honestly, for the right and proper unity of the nations in Israel in the future, right?
Mm.
Where we're not having to become one another, but we're living synergistically with one another. And there's a real sweetness in that, right? Just like marriage. Like, I don't
Yeah.
need to be a woman. I've seen that job. I don't want that job. But like, man, we're going to come
And I don't
together
want your job.
and we're going to become one. And I think that that's amazing. I do also think that because of this rapidity, like this rapid iterative reality that Messianic Judaism is in, I think current leaders of a certain generation, and I'm not trying to be mean, I think that they're really wrestling with what Messianic Judaism is and should be, because it is this, like, this type of clarity, for example, requires that you actually have conversations with people that come into the room and know them and know where they're at. And it might mean that people leave. And so then that might affect, like, giving. That might affect whether or not you can actually make a living as a congregational leader. Like, there's like real cost to this, right? There's a real cost to like having this type of clarity, but there's also, I believe, like real fruit on the other side of it, like this real spiritual fruit for both Jew and Gentile. And that to me is what I'm excited about. Like, you're kind of like throwing the gauntlet down with the video and being like, and I don't think that people understand, certainly in your comments section, I don't think that they understand the fruit of clarity. I also, like, if I'm just looking at the United States in general, postmodernist, nihilistic, and broken, there's no point to having clarity. There is no black and white.
Mm.
Like, it feels like oppressive when you say that there is a truth and people don't want to adhere to that. And yet it is actually the truth that sets us free.
Amen.
And I think that, anyways, I'm grateful. Once again, I'm grateful that we're actually having these sorts of conversations. And I think that these conversations need to be mandatory for leaders of communities, of Messianic congregations. And my encouragement to anybody who's part of a Messianic congregation is your community leader is not talking about these things concretely. Encourage them to have these sorts of conversations about identity, because there's spiritual fruit on the other side of it. I believe that one of the reasons why we're not seeing the spiritual fruit of more Jewish people seeking us out is because of the confusion. Like you said, like at some point when you would walk into a Messianic congregation and you'd see like
Right.
50 guys wearing a talit and you had no idea who was actually a Jew who's wrestling with Messiah at all is going to see that and recognize immediately. Their Judar is going to go off and be like, oh, there's something wrong here. And they're gone.
Yeah.
It's like a bad witness, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, the accusation always about Messianic Judaism is that we're just Baptists with beards. We're just people pretending to be Jews to try
Hey, I
to
was a Baptist. Oh,
ensnare some Jewish people, but you don't have a beard.
I don't have a beard.
Yeah. But like, I think about that, like, and I'm kind of wondering, like, you've had, I think, some broader experience with the movement than I have. You've had more experience, like, you're married into the UMJC, so you kind of know that world. You know the MJAA pretty well. You know Tikkun. You know some of the para congregational ministries. And I'm kind of curious, like, as you're looking at it, from that perspective, is there a percentage that you could put on the amount of leaders who get this, who understand that there's value in clarity, that there's truth that sets people free? And I know this is entirely just hypothesizing, and like, nobody should take this too seriously, and we don't have the comment section turned on, so you can't even argue with us about it. But I'm just kind of wondering, you've seen, I think, a lot of the Messianic movement. What is your idea? Like, if you were to say, like, this is the percentage of leaders of Messianic congregations that I've at least seen, or that responded in the survey, or whatever else, that feel like they really understand that this is important.
Yeah, that is a tough question to answer. I guess the most informed I can seek to be when it comes to this is from two different studies that I've done. One is that I think now I'm up to having watched 70 different UMJC and MJA congregational Shabbat morning live streams and taking notes on the liturgy and just making other observations and seeing how how they do things.
Oh, I'm so sorry for the quality of our live stream. If you've tried to watch ours, I apologize. Anyways, keep going. Keep going.
I did watch it. It was totally fine.
Okay. The sound is terrible. Anyways, whatever.
It was okay. And on one hand, I think there could be, I'll say it this way. I know that there are more rabbis that agree with me privately than there are congregations who practice what I'm sharing. And it's not because, these leaders don't have integrity, but like they're hamstrung by a lot of different factors, whether, they took over a congregation and, for 20 years, their congregation has done something. And so they, are very careful about changes that they make. Or, like you mentioned before, their entire community kind of depends on a certain contingency being there. And if they do something too quickly or something overnight or something the wrong way and an entire group leaves, it puts the entire, institution at risk. I understand there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but just taking congregational practice as a potential indicator of where our leadership falls on this issue. And also not just from watching, things without any background information, but I'm able to learn from talking to leaders and members of these congregations that get more insight. Even though a lot of them I am kind of relying on the eye test, whether somebody's Jewish or not, and how to what degree they're participating in. But of the 70 or so congregations that I watched, I would say that there's maybe around 8 or 10 that appear to be doing what I suggest, and the rest do what we've described before, where for them, Jews and Gentiles, like the way unity is expressed is through shared Jewish tradition and Torah observance for whatever the reason may be. And so I think on that metric, it's a quite a small number.
Yeah.
So maybe, I haven't watched every congregation, so maybe, you could double that number. Maybe it's around, 15, 20 or so of those who do it kind of in a way that align with what I was suggesting. Then there's the survey that I mentioned, which also, when it comes to the survey and other things I'm mentioning, like the spectrum of Hebrew roots, and I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but I created a resource called 13 Principles of Ethical Distinction in a Messianic congregation. So just as a resource to help equip leaders for communicating with their congregation for why potential changes are being made. You can go to twomessianicjews.com and go to the newsletter. If you sign up for the newsletter and select whatever you want from a checklist, we'll send those resources to you if you're just curious, or to equip and helping communicate these issues. And the survey is one of those things. So if you want a 75-page document of the survey results of Hebrew roots and Messianic congregations, that's something you can get if you sign up for the newsletter and request it. But on there, about, I think, of the 75 respondents, I believe 20 or so are current or former leaders. And every single one of them shared my perspective, at least in regards to Hebrew roots being a problem, and a proper way to respond to it is to more clearly distinguish between Jew and Gentile identity. So, of course, there's probably a variety in how to best accomplish that, but at least sharing that principle of distinction as a means to unity and as a means of helping resolve this Hebrew roots dilemma, there was total unanimous, agreement on. And so I think that is also useful to keep in mind. So I think it is a minority position, but I also am hopeful that once this is actually talked about, that it will empower others to not just think about it in a new way, but also empower those who hold this position already to express it and to share it and to talk about it. And because I honestly think, like, once this perspective really clicks with people, the beauty of it really shines. I think there's just an inherent beauty to truth and clarity, like you mentioned. Like the truth sets free. That's one of the principles, one of the ethical principles in the document that I share. And clarity is charity, I think is also something to keep in mind for people, especially as they struggle with identity issues. And I think there's something inherently beautiful about that that's recognized once it clicks with people, uh, and understand it, and all the brush is cleared of that it's not anti-Gentile, that it's not discriminatory. Like we're not saying this is a place for Jews only. Like once all that is cleared out and they understand, I think it's just inherently recognizably more beautiful than absorbing Gentiles into every Jewish practice and obscuring who they are in our eyes.
Wow, well put.
Yeah, very well put. I think
Actually,
I think
heartening. You should be heartened by the fact that so many of them shared, of those leaders shared. I'm surprised at that, frankly. That's great.
Yeah, no, I was very grateful to get that many former and current leaders. And, of course, in a way, it's a biased sample. It's those who are passionate enough to, answer the
Exactly.
survey
Right.
questions. But I certainly sent it out. It's funny, as we're talking about this, most of the Facebook followers of Two Messianic Jews are Hebrew roots people. And so
Wow, okay.
you can just tell, like, when you go through their profiles and things like that. And I sent out the survey to, hundreds, if not thousands, of Hebrew roots people. So they could have responded, but for anybody who sees the survey, it was pretty is a nearly unanimous objection to Hebrew roots in our congregations, and that it's a problem that we need to deal with. But also consistently, like, people distinguishing for themselves between Gentiles who are genuinely led to our community and Hebrew roots. People recognize there's a difference between the two. I don't think we need to worry too much about being perceived as if we're addressing Hebrew roots is simply anti-Gentile, at least for those who are actually in our community.
right.
Well, I think the boldness that you had to use the word hijack. I'm a former journalism teacher. That alone had to get 4,000 responses. Hijack? What?
I knew it was a good title, but it's funny because I thought of the title, and then the survey, I get the response from the survey, and two other people use that same word. And one of them was a Gentile and the other was a Jew.
Okay.
That Jewish people feel hijacked.
So 50-50.
Their identity feels hijacked by Hebrew roots.
Wow.
So it's people recognize it. And so I think as scary as it is certainly for leaders to talk about, I think there's a certain level of confidence that we can have as well, that it's worth wading through and powering through that initial wave of unrest to get to that beautiful treasure at the end.
Well put.
Amen.
Yeah.
Especially
Amen.
with intermarriage. I think the reason why I'm kind of like at loss for words is because I'm like heartened and disheartened at the same time by the results that you got, right? Like part of me is like, great, people are wrestling with this and they're taking it seriously and they're recognizing that clarity is really love. But man, who's actually living this out on Shabbat mornings in their communities?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
and it is, I know within our community, turning the ship was hard. And we could have another podcast at some point where we could walk through with you what that looked like.
I'd be very curious how you guys.
Because it felt very Holy Spirit led. It was like it became an unavoidable issue immediately at a men's breakfast. And so, but, I really want so much for our movement to not be waylaid. And to me, a lot of this just feels like us having to wade through stuff just to do what God has asked us to do.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
we gotta, and so you do, but you have to fight the good fight, and you have to face this instead of ignoring it. It's like Dr. Peterson talks about, like, I forget what book it is, but like, if you ignore the dragon, it grows, right?
Yeah.
You got to face it.
Yeah.
You actually have to look at it and be like, okay, this is not going to magically go away. Like, if we want to be able to properly celebrate the Gentiles who have that beautiful heart, we're going to have to take this seriously. And if we want there to
Yeah.
be breathing room for our intermarried families, we're going to have to take this seriously. And if we want a next generation of teenagers that can grow up side by side and be comfortable as Jew and Gentile within our congregations and not try to be one another, man, we have to take it seriously. And so I'm heartened and disheartened. I want there to be more, but I am certainly glad that it's a conversation that's being had, because honestly, until I watched your video, I was like, I feel like we're taking crazy pills. I feel like we're the only people that are seeing this. Is nobody else seeing Hebrew roots? What is happening? And I brought it up at the UMJC, and people were looking at me like, Hebrew roots? What are you on about? And I'm like, what are you on about? How, like, if you're not seeing it in your community, is it because it's not really happening, or are you just not seeing it in your, and I don't know. Maybe the answer is different for each one.
Well, I remember. Go ahead.
I'm curious the geographic makeup of that.
I am
like
too.
I know for a fact the American South is a hotbed of Hebrew roots. So
And
Texas,
the Northwest,
Georgia, and the Northwest.
Yeah,
so I wonder if the Northeast gets off a little scot-free.
Yep.
But it's certainly in the South, and you're attesting to the Northwest that it is an unavoidable problem.
Yes.
I think in our communities.
Yeah. Man. Well, Erik, thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. I know a little bit longer than we said, so I'm really grateful you could stay with us. And we really want to have you back for some more conversations, not just about Hebrew roots, but about some of the other things that you've studied over the years, and some of the other perspectives on Messianic Judaism. I also think it's great because I think you're younger than us, and it's really wonderful to have
younger than me, for sure.
For sure, me too. I've got a lot of gray in here, but it's really great to hear such clarity and such love and passion for our movement from a younger generation too, right? It is this thing that I think we've all bemoaned for quite some time of like, oh, what's going to happen? It's God's movement, as many people in your comment section attested to. It is actually God's movement, and He's going to do His will. And
Absolutely.
And I don't believe that He brought Messianic Judaism into existence just to have it be co-opted or for it to just peter out. I know that there's a real purpose to what we're doing here. So I'm grateful for you, and thank you, Mom, also for being part of this conversation.
Dear, sorry.
I know that I yapped too much. I'm sorry. So once again, I just do want to point out for those of you who are interested out there in the interwebs, if you want to go to twomessianicjews.com, and it's spelled out TWO. twomessianicjews.com, and look for their newsletter. Lots of good resources. And if you're interested, also, if you haven't watched the original video that Erik did, there's a ton of resources underneath his chapter markers there on YouTube. Lots of them. I made it through about half of Dr. Rudolph's paper on One New Man so far. It is dense and really well written.
Absolutely.
I would highly recommend for people to look at that. And I know that there's other resources in here too that I think people would find super valuable. So avail yourselves of these opportunities, guys, and may God give us grace as we move forward for Him and what He wants for Jews and Gentiles in this world. So thank you, Erik. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, those of you who have listened. If you want to check out our community in particular, go to Beth Yeshua, and like we announced earlier, you will have to email, and that email will come to Mom. It will come to Bubby, and she'll be like, hey, why do you want to come to Beth Yeshua? But hey, we'd still love for you to write in. BethYeshua.org is us. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time on the Beth Yeshua podcast.
Thanks, Erik. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can always visit BethYeshua.org for more.